Hi everyone. So I'm briefly going to talk about my current area of research, which is looking into how sleep affects athletic performance. I work in academia here at St Mary's, but I've also got a dual role in working with athletes as a sports scientist. So currently I've done a study where I've surveyed elite sports clubs and people working with elite athletes on recovery strategies. And within elite sport, there's a number of options. And one of the questions within that survey was, what's the most beneficial strategy for recovery? Or what do practitioners think is the most beneficial strategy? And there was a clear top three. I've not published this yet, but active recovery was there, nutrition, but by far the most recognised beneficial modality by practitioners, so S&C coaches, physios, etc., was sleep. So it's well recognised in elite sport that sleep's very important for performance. So how much sleep do we actually need? And this is the common question I get asked now, because athletes are well aware that it's important for performance. But the answer to that is there is no definitive answer, which often annoys athletes, that you can't say you need X amount of sleep. There are ranges that we work within. Now with adults, we know that most adults should get around 7 or more hours per sleep per night, and that's for optimal health. So if you don't, you're more likely to develop conditions and medical problems such as gaining weight, potentially becoming risk of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. But also practically, in terms of performance, it increases pain response. It can have a negative effect on various performance outcomes. It can increase risk of errors, and in some occupations that increases the likelihood of having an accident. So in some cases, chronic sleep loss can be a big problem, not just for your health, but also your safety. Now the picture changes slightly with children and adolescents. They actually need more sleep. So the younger you are, the higher your requirement for sleep. So in general, teenagers need around 8 to 10 hours, and children even longer, 9 to 12. But the context shifts if you're dealing with an athlete that's ill or injured. They actually need more for recuperation. So the takeaway point so far is that adults need less than children and adolescents in terms of sleep. So the question then becomes, well, are young athletes getting enough sleep? And the answer to that is probably not. The reason for that is because alongside commitments that children and adolescents have, such as school, college work, social commitments, family commitments, they've also got to train and compete, so that essentially their time for sleep can be compressed, particularly within elite young athletes that might be travelling a long way to get to training and competition. So this can be a problem, and it was recently reported in a study that young athletes, particularly high-performing young athletes, are more likely to have poorer quality sleep and a lower duration of sleep. So what does this mean? It's not been well studied in young athletes because there's a lot of ethical issues when you're sleep depriving people, but particularly children and adolescents. But a recent study emerged where they just looked at one night of sleep, self-reported sleep data. And what this study showed was, even just after one night, the athletes that were reporting a low amount of sleep, so I think 5 hours or less, their cognitive performance the next day was worse, and on various parameters, so reaction time, memory encoding and learning was worse. So we know that happens in adults, but also in children, that cognitive performance suffers. But what about physical performance? There's been a fair amount of research done on adults in terms of sleep loss and physical performance, but not so much on children, again, because of the ethical issues. This recent study was observational, so they looked at a netball tournament, and they surveyed the teams in terms of their sleep during the tournament, and what they found was a correlation. The athletes that slept more, they tend to be in teams that performed better in the tournament than the athletes that slept less. So there's some indirect evidence here that sleep or lack of sleep can have a negative impact on actual performance, physical performance. But it's not an easy relationship to discuss, because there are various factors that affect how you respond to a lack of sleep. So just because you have a lack of sleep on any given night, it doesn't mean you're always going to perform worse. I've worked on training camps where some athletes going into a competition have had 3 or 4 hours and they've gone and PB'd the next day. So it's not always as simplistic, if you sleep less, you're going to perform worse. And the reason for that is because there are a number of different things which can coincide with a lack of sleep that might affect your performance. So for example, other stressors, if you've got stress coming from, if you're a young athlete, maybe school, family, or even stress from social media we're seeing now, that can impact how your sleep loss affects performance. Similarly, when you're training or competing, the next day has an impact. So adult studies have shown that if you're sleep deprived, your performance doesn't seem to be too badly affected if you're competing in the morning, but if you're competing later in the day, in the evening, that's when the negative effects can transpire. The other factor, and I've come across this with athletes, is that some athletes respond really differently to sleep loss compared to others. So that means you might get one individual that has maybe a couple of awakenings or loses an hour or so of sleep, and they feel that their performance is really going to be affected the next day. Whereas, like I mentioned previously, some athletes can lose substantial amount of sleep and not feel too bad the next day and actually perform just as well. So the effect of sleep loss isn't predictable. We can't say if you lose X amount of sleep, you're going to have a poorer performance. Recently, there's been emerging evidence on injury and sleep loss, and basically the way the research has been conducted shows that if you're chronically sleep deprived, your risk of injury increases. So finally, what do we do about this? Well, in sport we can monitor sleep and we can use various tools. Simple diaries where the athlete just writes down how much sleep they've had, or we can use more sophisticated devices such as actigraphy and sleep monitoring apps. There is problems with this in that there can be questions over accuracy, and that means that we might falsely diagnose someone with a sleep problem when they haven't got one. But there is a good element of monitoring sleep, which is educational. So an athlete might not know that they're getting enough sleep until they actually start monitoring it. So my takeaway points are that sleep's really important for physiological and cognitive performance. Children and adolescents need more sleep than adults, but the requirement is individual. Chronic lack of sleep can affect performance, and that can be cognitive performance and physical performance. Monitoring sleep can be useful, particularly amongst young athletes, but there are some issues with it and we need to be careful how we do it. Thanks very much.